What really happened with your host, Mike Rivero. You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, where you'll find out what the Fukushima's going on.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're just now getting a story. Apparently over at in Texas at Ellington Airfield, an F-16 basically caught fire during takeoff. The plane crashed. The pilot ejected. He's in the hospital right now, and they're dealing with the fire. And it's another reminder that for all the cost involved, U.S. weapons really aren't very good at all, are they? All right, we're going to take a phone call here. Karen in Maryland, aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, for anybody who's hesitant to call in, I can just give you the good referral that you don't spend a half an hour on hold like you do with other radio shows. If anybody is discouraged for calling in for that reason, but anyway, I'll get on with it. The first question concerns political action committees. So since Hawaii is still a part of the U.S., I'll ask you this. Not necessarily what do you know about the LaRouche PAC. I presume that you have heard of the LaRouche PAC.
Yes, I have.
So my question is, in your opinion, is the LaRouche PAC closely modeled after the principles, agenda, and goals of the Constitution Party, or do you not consider the two of them similar at all?
The truth is, I don't know enough about either LaRouche PAC or the Constitution Party to have an opinion on that. I haven't been paying a lot of attention. I've only read a few of LaRouche's commentaries, and I'm completely unfamiliar with the Constitution Party.
Okay, so you wouldn't say then you're not qualified to make an opinion as to whether or not, like if the Constitution Party existed in the form of a PAC, it would be the LaRouche PAC.
Yeah, that's an accurate way of describing it, okay?
Okay, and the next question is about debit cards, DEBIT debit cards, like the ones that you stick into the ATM and so forth. I doubt that this is the case, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you anyway. When you pay with a debit card, not when you use it at the ATM, but when you actually pay with a debit card, does the transaction, does the amount that is taken out of your account, does that actually attach to any physical Federal Reserve notes, or is it completely an electronic transaction?
Completely electronic. Completely electronic.
Okay, so there do not have to be any Federal Reserve notes in reserve in order to cover that.
No. In fact, if you look at the total volume of currency in the U.S. economy, the physical paper and ink is actually a very, very small fraction. And of course, they're trying to basically wean us away from that as well. But we've had too many of these stories of these ATMs and debit card machines at the stores breaking down and literally locking people away from being able to buy food for their families. So I think there's going to be a real pushback against this idea of a cash-free society.
Okay, so in order to attach the Federal Reserve notes to the debit card, you physically have to withdraw it out of the ATM.
Yeah. If you withdraw it out of the ATM, then you have the physical cash in your hand.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Good show as always. Thank you. Bye.
And I'm typing something to our control person. There we go. All right, we got it. Now then, over in Germany, the U.S. has a military base at Mannheim that was actually scheduled to be closed. But because of this new build-up to a new world war, the Pentagon is now saying, we'd like to hang on to it. They're negotiating to extend its lease and keep it going. Now, down in Venezuela, as you know, they are in serious economic trouble down there. The U.S. has been carrying out covert war on Venezuela going all the way back to the time of Hugo Chavez. in part because Hugo Chavez had a bad habit of selling Venezuela's oil for the yuan, and then even worse than that, he would spend that oil revenue on the Venezuelan people, and that just sets a bad example for the serfs around the world. And there's been a lot of economic warfare, not to mention the lingering effects of that poorly thought out oil price war against Russia. That really put Venezuela into a serious position. And now the U.S. is out there talking about, well, maybe the U.S. should go on in and mediate the crisis between the government we would like to kick out and the new government we would like to put on in. And Venezuela's foreign minister is saying any attempt by the U.S. To go into Venezuela will be met with all available force. Sort of reminds me of that scene out of Avatar, when our protagonist is meeting his commander, and the commander's in the weight room, said, "I read your record, Venezuela, that was some mean bush." It's a reminder of just how James Cameron can be very, very prescient at times. We're going to do a shout-out now to our on-air affiliates who are just now rejoining the network. Over at the United Nations, little bit of a dust-up over there, because generally senior UN posts are held by those member nations that have the permanent veto on the Security Council. The United States, Britain, France, and China tend to dominate, but UN Chief Antonio Guterres is now going to appoint a Moscow envoy in Vienna to head a newly created UN Office of Counterterrorism. So now Russia is going to have influence over the United Nations policy in dealing with terror. And we know where this is coming from. If you're going to fight the terrorists, fight the terrorists. Don't go into Syria, say that you're fighting the terrorists, and actually fight Syria. So Guterres went out on a limb for this one, and I think it was the right thing to do here. Now, we have been talking about this 4-part series that History Channel put together, America's War on Drugs. It's airing now, and you can actually watch the episodes over at the History Channel itself. 3 have aired. The 4th one is going to come on, and they're stripping it. They're running it over and over and over again. And I just watched episode 2, which is titled Cocaine, Cartels, and Crackdowns. And I have to say, somebody at the History Channel has gonads of solid granite. It took a lot of courage to put this information out there into the public eye. And this episode goes into the CIA arming of the Contras after the Boland Amendment, and the funding of the operation by smuggling drugs into the United States, into Arkansas, under then-Governor Bill Clinton. They have these former CIA agents saying that, yeah, we all had problems with this, but the orders were coming from higher up. And one of the best parts of the show is this DEA agent who was trying to basically shut the smuggling down, and his superiors kept telling him, no, that's a protected operation, they're working for Felix Rodriguez, and so forth. And apparently this DEA agent actually got to meet Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush at a function at the embassy and put him on the spot. I think the CIA is running drugs. And Bush just laughed at him and walked away. And even if you do not watch the other episodes of this well-produced miniseries, watch this one. It flows along. It's very well edited, very good production values. Now, they use as much historical footage as they can, but obviously when you're talking about CIA and covert operations and drug running, there are not a lot of cameras around. So there's a little bit of dramatization, but it fits in very, very nicely. It's really a very good job. And, of course, for those of us who've been following on the crimes of Mena, going all the way back to the 1980s in Arkansas, this is a vindication to see all the stuff we have been talking about, you know, out there on the corporate media. They even mentioned the airport at Mena, Arkansas. And they showed Barry Seal and how he was flying guns for the CIA and flying drugs. And it's an eye-opener, and I recommend it highly, and I recommend that you grab it off the History Channel website and you send it to everybody that you know. Because this stuff really did happen. We weren't making it up. Think of all those years that we were called conspiracy theorists and, oh, our government would never do anything like that. Here it is. It's all out there by the people who were there who saw it happen. Now, they didn't go into all the details. They didn't go into the circumstances under which Barry Seal was finally killed. They didn't go into the train deaths. They certainly did not go anywhere near the money laundering. But they did obliquely mention that in Arkansas, law enforcement was being kept away from the CIA's drug and gun running operation. They don't mention who was responsible, but in the state government, who's got that kind of juice to tell the cops and the drug investigators stay away? So it's a very, very good show. And that episode, unless there's something really surprising in the fourth one, that's my favorite episode. I recommend it highly. In fact, that's your homework. It's going to be a pop quiz tomorrow, so study up on this one. Getting into the economic news, Japan is now considering joining China's One Belt, One Road project, an initiative. And basically it shows that Japan's posture toward China is now relaxing. They're thinking about going back to being friends, peace through commerce. And Abe said Japan was ready to cooperate with OBOR under certain conditions. And obviously here in the United States of America, Wall Street and the government are very concerned because if China can make this work, China will be positioned as a regional leader, displacing the United States' control over that part of Asia. And I think they'll do it. It's very obvious the United States is an empire in decline. They've got all the symptoms. Got all the symptoms. Ford is now shifting production of the Ford Focus to China, moving out of Michigan and Mexico, supposedly to cut costs. I thought Ford was one of the companies that agreed with Donald Trump that we had to bring the jobs back here to the United States. Now, we've been talking about the pension crisis. It's all over the country. It's ultimately going to affect everyone. General Electric's pension is billions and billions in the hole. And now we're getting word that the Teamsters private pension is hovering at the edge of bankruptcy, and some 407,000 retirees may be left with virtually nothing. Right now, the Teamsters pension is paying out $3 for every $1 it takes in. Obviously, that is not sustainable. Bitcoin is back. India has legalized cryptocurrencies, and that reignited interest and demand in Bitcoin. It's back up above $2,700. Here's a very telling statistic. 69% of Americans do not have an adequate emergency fund. You've always heard the phrase, save for a rainy day. You've got to have something in case something goes wrong. And most Americans don't have that. They're just barely paying their bills month after month after month. They're barely putting food on the table. We have been impoverished by Wall Street greed and the war machine. There's nothing left out here. Been a new development in the Grenfell Tower disaster. As you know, earlier in the week we were talking about how these survivors had lost their identity cards. Either they lost them in the fire. Apparently some of the residents in this tower were refugees who had not yet received their papers. But apparently residents who survived the Grenfell Tower fire and do not have a home are going to be moved to 68 luxury flats in nearby Kensington Row, which is a very upscale area where private apartments in this luxury block can go for £1.5 million. I'm sure it's going to be a tremendous improvement. Meanwhile, the numbers are just not adding up with the official claim of only 79 dead. And there are accusations of a cover-up. The building housed 600 people. And looking at the number who appear to have survived and went to the hospital or didn't go to the hospital or were relocated, the numbers don't add up. I think the death toll was a lot higher. Okay, Germany says 100 million African refugees could head north. The German Development Minister Gerd Müller is saying that these refugees are heading to Europe as economic and climate refugees. That's the new term. They're climate refugees. They're escaping global warming. Actually, we're going into an ice age. If you're a climate refugee, you want to be heading toward the equator. But it is amazing how they're still pushing that agenda. Now, as you know, a lot of the European Union member states are digging in their heels on this refugee problem. It's caused all kinds of difficulty. It has strained their social safety nets, huge financial losses, increase in crime, rape, robbery, burglary, violence directed between various religious groups, no-go zones, and they're really kind of getting fed up with that. So apparently defense officials of 6 Central European countries and the Balkans are now pledging close cooperation in tackling migration with all possible means, including use of armed forces. Austria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, and Slovenia have created a grouping called the Central European Defense Cooperation that they are proposing as a role model for the entire European Union. And one of the agendas they have there is that anybody who wants to apply for asylum in European Union countries have to do it outside the European Union. You don't just get to walk on in and then file the paperwork. You file the paperwork first, and somebody will make a decision whether you can come in or not. And unfortunately, the refugees are really causing a huge amount of damage to their own cause by their behavior. And apparently, the deputy leader of Britain First, Jada Franson, a few of her colleagues decided to take a stroll down the street in Bury Park, which is now a primarily Muslim district of the city, to see how Muslims reacted to the wearing of a cross. And needless to say, they reacted very badly and basically screamed that Christians need to understand Muslims have now taken over the entire country. Now, over on YouTube, they put up this video, More Than a Refugee, which is a pro-open border puff piece. And it did not do well at all. As of the last time we checked, it had accumulated over 132,000 downvotes versus 54,000 upvotes. So people are definitely chilling on this idea of open borders and blending everybody together. Been another accident over in the French port of Calais. Apparently, migrants set up a roadblock. And the reason they do that is they try and get the trucks to slow down enough where they can climb on board and get a ride through that channel tunnel. And the truck drivers, because there have been robberies, don't want to stop for them. And so apparently these migrants literally put 3 tree trunks across the roadway, and this van hit it, and the driver has died. So. Apparently over in London's North End, Stamford Hill, there's been a fight between Hasidic Jews and Muslims. And the riot police had to respond. Things got really, really nasty. Over in Hungary, they're making it very clear they want a new border policy. They have a brand new electrified border wall with watchtowers and guards with machine guns. They are being very, very serious about all of this. They want to control who comes into their country. And that's a natural right of any country. This idea that there shouldn't be borders, it's nonsense. You have a right to decide and choose who gets in, who does not. You certainly don't want criminals coming in. You do not want people carrying contagious diseases coming on in. We're going to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Another example of military snafu. Apparently, the Pentagon shelled out $30 million for Afghan Army uniforms that were the wrong color. And apparently, the guy in charge of getting the uniforms saw this very colorful camouflage pattern that he liked while he was browsing on the Internet and said, I think we're going to get that. And he ordered the uniforms with this woodland, urban, and temperate patterns, despite Afghanistan being about 95% desert. And then they wonder why the American people are saying the Pentagon has enough money to play with here. And don't forget all those trillions that they simply misplaced. They simply just misplaced. All right, getting on back here to the European Union. The former president of the Czechoslovakian Republic, Klaus, is saying, we will not let the European Union transformed the Czech Republic into a multicultural society. Everybody is digging their heels in on this one. This could actually break up the EU. I used to think it was going to be the extreme poverty and hardship caused by the European Central Bank that would break up the Union. But this refugee crisis, Brussels is threatening sanctions, and these other countries are threatening back. Meanwhile, up in Germany, the country's Commissioner for Refugee Integration, Aiden Ozuguz, I hope I pronounced that correctly, is saying that 3/4 of the refugees in Germany will still be out of a job in 5 years' time. That means 3/4 of the refugees now in Germany will be living off the German taxpayer for the next 5 years. And I'm sure the German taxpayers are not happy about that, because they're already picking up the cost for a lot of the other European Union nations that are not doing as well as Germany. Meanwhile, Starbucks has announced that in its European stores, they're going to hire 2,500 refugees to promote jobs for refugees, so forth and so on. It didn't work out here in the U.S. Remember when Starbucks announced they were going to hire refugees over indigenous Americans or over unemployed veterans, and everybody just boycotted Starbucks, and they're still pushing this agenda out there. Now, getting on over to Paris, there was a recent case where this man rammed a car into a police van in Paris. It turns out this guy was on a French watch list. And despite that, he had a cache of weapons at his home, and he held a gun permit, despite being on the list of people linked to radical Islam. It sort of makes you wonder, was this guy somebody's asset? Was he a patsy? Or are all these lists just worthless? Story that came out of WorldNet Daily, and it's a very telling one. It's basically a first-person experience coming out of the city of Utica, and how it was literally flooded by Muslim refugees who basically just came on in, and there was a conversion of a Methodist church into a mosque, and all of a sudden they're seeing these refugees who are not yet legal citizens are somehow able to get into positions of power and authority. The social worker at the school is Muslim, the administrator who okays homeschooling is Muslim, CPS worker is Muslim, the nurse practitioner at the ER is Muslim, the doctor at the ER is Muslim. These are positions that hold a wheel of power. And basically she's saying the city of Utica is gone. It's been erased by the flood of refugees. And of course that's what the globalists like George Soros want. They want to erase our cultural, regional identity. They want to erase the borders. And that's why there are all these attacks on things like the Confederate flag and the statues and all the rest of it. They're trying to erase our memory of who we are and where we came from. Because people with a strong sense of identity, strong sense of self, are much more difficult to control. They even want you confused over which bathroom you got to use. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha America, welcome back to the show here, and right now I'm watching the press conference over this morning's stabbing attack on an officer at the airport in Flint, Michigan, and apparently the attacker was shouting Aloha Snack Bar. It turns out he's a Canadian citizen. and they are saying that, yes, this was an act of terrorism. So a lot of craziness going on here. Okay, let's get on back to the news. As you're probably aware, a lot of states are trying to pass laws that restrict the public's access to police body cameras. I mean, if the body cam footage supports the police officer, of course it will be made public. If it does not support the police officer's version, then they can rely on these laws to say you're not allowed to look at it. Pennsylvania just went the other way. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court has ruled police dash cam videos are public records and must be released under the state's right-to-know law. And there does need to be some accountability and transparency because of some of the situations where things get out of control. I mean, there was that video. This officer pulls over a guy because his brake lights aren't working. The driver informs the officer he's got a gun, and all of a sudden the officer just hauls off and shoots him. And by the way, the driver did have a permit for carrying the gun. He was in full compliance with the law. And the officer's out there saying, I feared for my life, I feared for my life. I want to know what prescription antidepressants that cop was on. Meanwhile, in response to the Columbine incident some years ago, Colorado has decided they are going to arm and train their teachers in classrooms. They're going to have all the teachers take a gun safety course and regular trips to the shooting range to maintain proficiency in order to discourage anybody from trying to repeat what happened back in 2012. I think that's actually a very good idea. It's going to, it is going to deter people from doing something like that. Any one of these mass shootings you look at, where do they go? The gun-free zones. So let's get rid of the gun-free zones. The other benefit is it's going to demystify guns for the students. Now, up until now, we've had all these efforts to say guns are bad, guns are evil, and if they just see their teachers just wearing them on the belt, then it's just another tool. It's just another tool. And again, I come from an age where you were allowed to take your guns to school because you were going to varmint the farm fields when you walked home from school that day. Schools actually had shooting clubs. Schools would teach gun safety. We need to go back to that. We never had to deal with mass shootings or any craziness like that. Of course, we also didn't have those prescription antidepressants. In all the years I lived in that town, there was only one bad incident with a gun, and that appeared to have been a botched attempt at suicide. Now, getting on to computers and various other things like that, apparently the Supreme Court has declared that political correctness is not a guide for the Patent and Trademark Office. We mentioned this before, where there was this band that had a band name called the Slants, and they're Asian kids, and they wanted to trademark that, and the Patent and Trademark Office said, no, 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 it's politically incorrect, it's politically incorrect. And the Supreme Court said, no, if somebody registers a trademark, you have to give it to them. It is free speech to come up with a brand name. Everybody's too sensitive. Everybody's been taught that being offended by every little thing is now socially acceptable. Grow a skin. Buy a helmet. There are way too many people in our society whose entire sense of self-worth is always finding something to be offended by, and if you give these people free rein, you're always going to have somebody screaming at you, that offends me, that offends me, that offends me. Okay, be offended. I don't care. Apple's come out with what I think is a really good idea. They want programming added to the school curriculum. Apparently, Apple CEO Tim Cook told President Trump during their little tech giant meeting that Trump should consider making computer coding classes mandatory for schools. We live in an age of computers. The more you know how to work with them, the more effective you will be. A lot of user applications actually have coding languages built into them to extend their capabilities. I'll give you a good example. A music software package Claire uses for her choirs called Sonar. And it has an internal programming language called Cal. And many times we can get Sonar to do things the original creators never imagined by writing Cal scripts for it. I do the writing of the Cal scripts. But yeah, it's a good idea. Plus it's a useful skill. Kids are going to be able to get jobs with that. Now there's another Supreme Court decision regarding the Internet, and it's caused a lot of controversy. But again, as a supporter of the Bill of Rights, I have to agree with them. And basically the Supreme Court ruled in this case that you cannot ban people from the Internet, no matter what they've done. Now, in this case, it was a very contentious situation where somebody carried out sex crimes against a minor that were lured and encouraged over the Internet. Sort of like what Anthony Weiner was doing, sexting the underage girl. Now, obviously, that's bad behavior, and you want to deal with the bad behavior. But the Supreme Court said you can't be banned blanket from the Internet, no matter what they've done. So, I can see one possible exception to that, and that would be in the case of people who commit computer crime, banning them from the Internet, just the way a convicted felon is prohibited from owning a gun. Meanwhile, the WannaCry virus is back. It's infected a Honda factory near Tokyo. They had to shut it down for over 24 hours while their computers were rebooted and restored from backup. And apparently computer systems in several plants around the world were affected by the WannaCry virus as well. And they had to halt production in Sayama, Japan. So, and again, where is the NSA and the FBI and the CIA on all this cybercrime that's going on? They're too busy spying on law-abiding Americans. The real criminals have got free reign here. John McAfee is out there saying basically every router in America has been compromised by the three-letter agencies. And again, all of these back doors are being discovered by the cyber criminals in basically violating our Fourth Amendment right to privacy in the name of fighting crime and terror. The three-letter agencies have left us wide open to all kinds of criminal activity. We're vulnerable. We're not protected. And the government isn't doing anything about the cybercrime. And we proved with our NSA encryption challenge that real criminals and real terrorists can quite easily come up with methods of encryption that the NSA cannot break because they don't have the method. So, what a vile place this has become. Let's see. I wanted to do this. There he is. Paul Craig Roberts came out with this article, Another Step Toward Devastating War. And basically, I love the last line of the article. Paul Craig Roberts, we've had him on the show here. Putin, the leader of the free world, should not be on the defensive from a bankrupt, two-bit punk, washed-up government in Washington that wallows in evil. I think that really does say it all. We, the American people, need to stand up and take an honest assessment of the denizens of Washington, D.C., that swamp, and realize they are not good people. They are corrupt beyond redemption. Now, seismologists, volcanologists, if you will, are a little bit concerned because there has been a swarm of very small earthquakes in Yellowstone Park, northwest of the lake. And by the way, we had an earthquake here just when the show was starting, down on the Big Island, and we felt that. But there have been more than 460 of these earthquakes recorded so far. And their largest quake was a magnitude 4.4. They felt that one. Most of them are magnitude 2, magnitude 1, and a lot of the seismic maps won't even show them because they sort of cut off below 2.0. They figure it doesn't really matter. But a lot of people are very concerned about this. The University of Utah, which is keeping an eye on there, and basically they're saying there have been 460 earthquakes recorded since June the 12th. Now, little something to keep in mind. Not all swarms produce an eruption. But the concern is all eruptions are preceded by a swarm. We saw that with Mount St. Helens. The reason there were so many cameras up there, the reason there were so many observations being made was Mount St. Helens had a quake swarm, a significant one. And everybody got there, and sure enough, it blew. Yellowstone will blow at some point. Hopefully not when we're alive. But it will blow. And it will devastate the western part of the United States and significant portions of Canada and Mexico. If the eruption is big enough, it could come close to being an extinction level event through the dust in the air blocking the sun. When there was a big volcano, I think it was Tambora, when it blew, we literally had a year without a summer. And there was famine all over the world. We have not, in our lifetime, in recent history, seen just how incredibly powerful acts of nature can be. We see the scars of them. The earlier calderas from Yellowstone itself. Toba, that supervolcano. The remains of Santorini in the Mediterranean. So it is an area of concern, and hopefully the swarm will die down. But sooner or later, Yellowstone is going to blow. And obviously, if you're living anywhere near close to that, have a bailout kit ready to go, because you're going to have to go. There is a question now being asked where apparently suicide rates are rising in the USA. And they're basically saying that people in the age range of 45 to 64 are matching the same rates of suicide in people 85 and older. The middle age range has been going up steadily year after year. And these people who are committing suicide, they're in a time of life when they're supposed to be enjoying the rewards of a life well spent and looking forward to retirement. So what is going on? Well, certainly part of it has to do with the economy. So many people have had their lives destroyed by the economic machinations, or they were victims of the Clintons back in the 1980s. And they may be driven to suicide just because they prefer that over homelessness. Or again, because some 20 to 25% of Americans are on prescription antidepressants, and people on prescription antidepressants have a high per capita incidence of committing suicide. That might be the factor as well. We should be finding out. Unfortunately, we've reached a position in this country where there are important questions we should be asking that we're told not to ask because it threatens some corporation's profitability. Now, as you know, a lot of people have been talking about the opiate problem in this country. We're not talking about the street opium. We're talking about prescription opiates. Prescriptions being written on out, pharmaceutical companies actually encouraging, incentivizing doctors to write these prescriptions and literally create a customer class of people who are addicted to these medications. And right now, as a result of that, the United States consumes 80% of the entire world's opioid prescriptions. 80%. That tells you something very crooked is going on, because it's totally out of proportion with our population relative to other countries. Another story, this one came out of the Daily Mail. This is very unpleasant. Speaking of prescription antidepressants, children younger than 6 are being prescribed antidepressants by doctors who are using them as a sticking plaster. And what they found out in this study is doctors handed out 198,000 prescriptions for drugs to treat depression and anxiety to children younger than 18 between April 2015 and September 2016. Of these prescriptions, 12,700 were given to children aged 7 to 12, and 617 prescriptions went to children younger than 6. Children do not need antidepressants. It's just another marketing ploy. It's all big business. And these medications are dangerous. There is a clear correlation between prescription antidepressants and self-harm and acts of violence. Go on over to ssristories.com and take a look at some of those case studies that are over there. Look at all the mass shooters wagged at us by the gun grabbers who were either on or withdrawing from those medications. Meanwhile, over at a clinic used by the U.S. Air Force on that base in Qatar, apparently 135 people have been infected with blood-borne diseases, including HIV, from unclean medical tools. They weren't sterilizing them properly between usage. So, it's insane. It is just insane out there. There is a new concern that nanoparticles that are produced from combustion engines, if you inhale them over a period of time, can contribute to the development of Alzheimer's disease. And this article is asking, is that why so many city dwellers seem to be going batty? And maybe, we don't really know what exposure to all this stuff is doing. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back, leading up to the top of the hour. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Now, Energy Secretary Rick Perry is now out there saying that carbon dioxide is not the primary control driving climate change. And he is absolutely correct. The impact of human activity and carbon dioxide on the climate is almost immeasurably small. The primary control over our climate is solar radiation and the changing shape of the Earth's orbit. That's what does it. He's absolutely correct. Apparently up there in the Klondike, or actually in the Yukon, they have an annual 150-mile bike race. Had to be canceled by snow, and yes, it's way up north in Alaska, but it is June, and you need to remember, especially this being the solstice, that up in Alaska, they actually have very warm summers because the sun is up, almost all day, especially above the Arctic Circle. The sun never sets, so they get a lot of heat and energy. Apparently, despite the cancellation, 4 people actually completed the entire race in the middle of the snowstorm on unicycles. Boy, you have to love those Alaskans here. CNN is out there now saying that hot deserts are proof of human-caused global warming. They're still out there pushing that nonsense. They really, really are. Okay, let's see. We're looking at some other stories here. Apparently over in Olympia, Washington, at the Evergreen State College, more violence, more rhetoric. The liberals apparently are having a negative reaction to the results of yesterday's elections. And they're not handling it very well. They're not handling it at all. So let's see. We were talking yesterday about high fructose corn syrup. Just in case you were wondering, it has now been renamed so that you won't see it on the label, and they're calling it. They're actually calling it a natural sweetener. That's what will appear on the label, natural sweetener. Even though, if you remember yesterday's guest, Dr. Renee Dufault, was saying it's a manufactured material, and the manufacturing process involves toxic chemicals. But unfortunately, I know they were talking about naming it corn sugar as well. And as I was telling her, the food processors use euphemisms and deceptive labeling. And according to Renee, the FDA's primary job is making sure food is labeled accurately, and apparently they're not doing that. They're letting these companies get away with euphemisms for monosodium glutamate, and now they're letting them get away with concealing the high fructose corn syrup. And that's something I can't have. It triggers hypoglycemia in me. Regular, natural, organic sugar, I don't have a problem with. High fructose corn syrup, yeah, there's a problem. Okay, there's the music. We're going to take a break here. When we come on back, Miriam Azizi is going to be talking with us about human rights over in Israel.